You.
Yes.
Good morning, everyone. It's my pleasure and privilege to invite you all to this lecture by Mr. Anil Malhotra. He really does not require an introduction. Anyone who has even remotely come across international family law in India, intercountry adoptions or abduction of children, would have all been familiar with his name. He's been practicing since 1983. He holds degrees from the Punjab University, the University of London, the London School of Economics, and the SOAS. He's been extensively writing on international family law, a number of books, a large number of publications over a career that has spanned over 35 years. He's also been regularly been appointed as amicus curiae by different courts in these matters. Like I said, there's really no need to introduce him, and it's our privilege to host him today at Sai University for this lecture. He's really taken out time from his busy schedule and other commitments, and he's actually stretched himself to talk to you. I request you all to make the best out of this opportunity. Without taking any more of his time, sir, I welcome you to Sai University, and I request you to talk to our students.
Thank you, Mahesh. Thank you for the kind introduction. Now, coming straight to the topic. In private international law, as you found in Cheshire and texts of Massey, is now in a new jurisprudence. And curriculums worldwide in international universities call private international law international family law. So we are looking at a global family law. Now, this has a very relevant jurisprudential aspect as far as India is concerned, because we are 1.3 billion in number, and 30 million Indians live abroad in 200 countries. A large number of them are OCIs or PIOs, but the fact of the matter is that there are so many people abroad that they bring in a crop of absolutely new litigation, which the conventional Indian legal system is not able to resolve, because we have laws which do not cater for these situations. Coming straight to the matter of custody of children and international child custody disputes, first let us understand what is the legal framework we are looking at with the statutory provision of law in India. Now, we have the personal law for the majority community in India, the Hindus, and like the Hindu Marriage Act, the Hindu Adoption and Maintenance Act, the Hindu Succession Act, we have the Hindu Minority and Guardianship Act 1956, which essentially is the baseline for majority population, that is the Hindus. So we will look at the context of the personal law insofar as Hindus is concerned, then we will switch to the secular law. The Muslim laws, the Parsi laws, the Christian laws are more or less the same as the Hindu law. Now, under Section 6 of the Hindu Minority and Guardianship Act, the father and after him the mother, though in Geeta Hariharan's case, they are both equal, the father and the mother are the natural guardians of the children. And insofar as custody is concerned, Section 6 says that the custody of a minor child who is less than 5 years of age shall ordinarily be with the mother. Now, the consideration for determination and the best interest in the welfare of the children is determined vis-a-vis the Hindu Minority and Guardianship Act, saying that the paramount consideration insofar custody is concerned shall be the welfare of the child. So there is no statutory right overpowering the welfare of the child. But also Section 1 of the Hindu Minority and Guardianship Act says that it shall apply to all Hindus. And then in Section 2, it says that this act is supplemental and not in contravention or violation of the Guardian and Wards Act of 1860. Now, the Guardian and Wards Act is actually a colonial piece of legislation which has not changed despite the Law Commission's recommendations. So the Guardian and Wards Act is a secular legislation which is which covers all persons. So it is religion free, it is free of personal law constraints, and the Hindu Minority and Guardianship Act takes you back to the Guardian and Wards Act. And in this context, the Guardian and Wards Act of 1890 rules the roost. How? Now, if there is a interparental child custody conflict, then if a parent wants singular custody of his or her child, then the judicial remedy to be invoked is not available under the Hindu Minority and Guardianship Act. So effectively, the HMGA does not contain any statutory provision which entitles you to file a petition before a family court or a guardian judge for claiming custody. So you have to route your petition through the Guardian and Wards Act 1890, because the form of the petition, the procedure for deciding a petition, and other details vis-a-vis guardianship and custody are concerned are contained in the Guardian and Wards Act. So looking at it very bluntly, we are going back to a legislation of 1890 if we want to seek singular custody of children. Now, since you are focused on international child custody disputes, let us examine in a very large scenario where we are as far as India is concerned. Now, because of 30 million people vis-a-vis Indians moving up and down, the magnitude of child custody disputes has increased multifold over a period of time. Now, insofar India is concerned, interparental child removal, or child removal for that matter, is not defined in any legislation. And if there is a removal of a child by one parent, it is not considered as a wrong or an offense by the Indian courts. Where is the definition of child removal? How is the child removal concept enshrined in an international scenario? For that, we have to go back to the Hague Convention on Civil Aspects of International Child Abduction, 1980. Now, this is a convention which is signed by 100 countries. India has not signed this convention. Now, let me explain to you how inter-country, interparental child removal works. We have the Hague Conference of Private International Law at The Hague in Netherlands. Whichever country wants to accede or sign a convention and make it a law, signs the convention and makes an internal law to give teeth to the convention. So all the countries who are signatories to the Hague Convention have signed the convention, have made internal laws, and have created bodies which are known as the Central Authority, which administratively deal with child removal. So the central authority of one country will contact the central authority of the other country when there is a child removal between two signatory countries. And Article 3 of the Hague Convention defines child removal, or it defines the removal or retention of a child as wrongful, one, where it is in breach of rights of custody attributed to a person, an institution, or any other body, either jointly or alone, under the law of the state in which the child was habitually resident immediately before the removal or retention, and at the time of the removal or retention, those rights were actually being exercised either jointly or severally, or would have been exercised for the right of removal. Now, the right of custody mentioned in the first part of the definition may arise by operation of law, or by reason of a judicial or an administrative direction, or by reasons of an agreed parent having legal effect under the law of that state. So effectively, when one parent defies the rights of the other parent, child removal comes into force. Now, our courts have gone to the extent to say, I have circulated you the decisions. I'm not going to go into individual citations. Our courts say that wrongful removal or retention of a child, violating the rights of a parent, even violating the order of a foreign court, does not amount to a wrong or an offense. This is the broad understanding of Indian law as far as India is concerned. So, in this backdrop, what happens effectively when there is child removal? So let us say a child is removed by one parent from the US, UK, Canada, Europe, or whatever, and brought to India by the other parent. There may be a court order of the foreign court, there may not be a foreign court order. Now, the aggrieved parent living abroad immediately moves the court in the country from where the child was brought, and armed with that foreign court order comes to India to seek its implementation. And what remedy does he or she invoke? The first choice preferred is a writ of habeas corpus under Article 226 of the Constitution before a High Court, or maybe directly under Article 32 before the Supreme Court. Since you are all lawyers, you know that the jurisdiction, writ jurisdiction under 32 or 226 is an extraordinary jurisdiction, and it is exercised by the High Court and the Supreme Court, irrespective of the fact whether it has jurisdiction or not, because insofar child custody matters is concerned, a habeas corpus is addressed to the welfare of the child. So the parent seeking custody invokes the parent's paternal jurisdiction. It invokes the overall jurisdiction of the court as the guardian because the child is in its custody. In a habeas corpus, in a child removal matter, following English law and following American law, we go back as far as to Gohar Begum, 1960 Supreme Court, and Neel Ratan Kundu, 2011 Supreme Court, to say that when a habeas corpus is invoked in a child removal matter, it is not addressed to the illegality of the detention. It is addressed to the welfare of the child. So, sometimes courts or judges misunderstand, saying a habeas corpus is not maintainable because it is only meant to secure the person in illegal custody or in illegal detention. But our courts have gone to say that a habeas corpus in a child removal matter is addressed to the welfare of the child, is addressed to the betterment and the best interest of the child. So therefore, this is insofar as the maintainability of a habeas corpus is concerned. So either you come in a 32 petition or you come in a 226 petition. 226 petition is preferable because the Supreme Court can say, why don't you go to the High Court concern? But there have been cases like Dr. Ravi Chandran's case in 2011, where Justice Lodha had directed the CBI to find a lady who was moving from state to state, and therefore the 32 petition was required because it was an interstate removal issue. Now, before we come into the nitty-gritties, let us also look at what the Guardian and Wards Act does. So, if you are seeking singular custody of a child whom you have brought from a foreign jurisdiction, or you may wish to file if you are coming from a foreign jurisdiction, you will file a petition under the Guardian and Wards Act under section 9, 10, 11, 12. But then you have the biggest hurdle under section 9 of the Guardian and Wards Act, because section 9 says that a petition for the custody of the child shall be filed before the court of the guardian judge where the minor ordinarily resides. So this ordinarily resides is the catchphrase. Now, ordinarily resides over a span of 50 years has been interpreted in different ways, but Ruchi Maju's judgment by Justice Thakur in 2011 defines ordinarily resides to say where the minor habitually and permanently resides. There are judgments of the Delhi High Court which also say that ordinarily resides means the place of residence where the minor was residing when in permanently or in a habitual state for a long period of time. So if a minor is residing in Delhi, Bombay, Calcutta only for a short period, or is brought there and is on the day of the filing of the petition present there, he is not ordinarily residing in that jurisdiction. So this is the biggest hurdle you can face. And whenever I'm faced with the Guardian and Wards Act petition for a respondent, I always say, please decide the issue of ordinarily residing first in an Order 7 Rule 11 application on jurisdiction, because Ruchi Maju's case says if the guardian judge has no jurisdiction, then he cannot pass any order. So therefore, the long and short of it is, minor ordinarily residing can be a baseline to prevent any similar guardianship petition if the minor is not living in the jurisdiction of that place. So now this is in contrast to the powers of a writ court. Ruchi Maju's case also says that even if the minor is not ordinarily residing in the jurisdiction of the High Court or the Supreme Court, the High Court or the Supreme Court can pass orders in the best interest and welfare of the child. Now, we must understand that the jurisdiction which the High Court or the Supreme Court exercises in 32 or 226 is a very vast jurisdiction. It's an extraordinary jurisdiction. And therefore, there are no hurdles or shackles of technical law of procedure. And in this context, the Ruchi Maju's case in 2011 says that if a court has no jurisdiction to entertain a petition for custody or pass any order, then in that circumstance, the party agreed has to seek any other legal remedy available to him or her, but the guardian judge has no jurisdiction to entertain the proceedings. So this is as far as the hurdle of minor ordinary rights is concerned. Now let us come to see how the law has developed over a period of time. So we go back to Gohar Begum, 1960 Supreme Court, for the first time saying that parents betray is the power of the writ court. Gohar Begum was a case under the old CRPC 1898. At that time, the habeas corpus was a criminal writ under the CRPC. It is still known as the criminal writ because it is based on the 1898 Code of Recovery of Custody. But you are actually filing a petition under 226. So it is called a civil writ petition because it is under 226. Now, because after this 1973 amendment, the power has been gone. The power under the CRPC has gone away. And the power is now vested with a civil court. So it is labeled as a CWP and not as a criminal writ. So do not make the mistake of filing a petition as a criminal writ petition. It is a petition. Some high courts use 226 and 227 both. But if you file it under 226, I think you're safe because you are invoking the writ court. Now, we also have Neel Ratan Kundu, a celebrated decision of 2009, which following the English and American jurisprudence has said that when a habeas corpus is addressed to the court, it is addressed to the parents betray jurisdiction and not to the illegality of the detention, and therefore we follow English and American law in that context. Now, the law on interparental child removal custody litigation is all developed through case law. Reason being, child removal is not an offense. It is not under any statute. Because it is not under any statute, there is no remedy, and therefore there is no interpretation of statute as such. Now, we start with the first decision in Surinder Kaur. Now, this is a 1984 decision by Justice Y.V. Chandrachud, where they said we will excise summary jurisdiction and we will return the child back to the country of its origin, that was UK at that time, following the principle of comity of courts. Then came Elizabeth Dinshaw in 1987, where the court, again exercising a summary power of removal, upheld the right of the foreigner mother to directly invoke the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court for seeking the return of the child. Now, as practitioners, you must understand that if you are faced with a technical hurdle on an objection by the registry or even by a court saying, how can a foreigner file a petition? You are not an Indian citizen. Now, this is a very archaic thinking. We must understand that when we invoke the jurisdiction under 32 or 226, it is addressed to rights under Article 21 and under Article 14. 14 and 21 are available to persons. 19 is available to citizens. And if you look at the language in 32 or 226, the right to invoke a writ jurisdiction is available to persons. I have filed petitions on behalf of innumerable foreigners, even on even institutions where child custody matters are concerned. So don't be bogged down with a technical hurdle that a foreigner cannot file a writ petition, because the right is available to persons, and if you're a person, neither nationality nor religion matters. So if you're a foreign parent, there is no bar on you. Sometimes you face this objection. I have seen even honorable judges in the High Court raise this objection, but then you have to get over it within a very logical way. Now, coming down to the sequence of case law, in Dhanvanti Joshi, sometimes in 1998, the Supreme Court changed. The Supreme Court said that the order of the foreign court will only be one consideration in dealing with the matters of child custody. India is not a signatory to the Hague Convention, and the jurisdiction of the child who is removed will be considered on merits, irrespective of the foreign court order. And Supreme Court did not exercise summary jurisdiction, differing from the earlier judgments. Then the observations in Dhanvanti Joshi were followed in Sarita Sharma in 2000, in the year 2000. Then in Sarita Sharma, the Supreme Court declined to grant the custody of the child to the mother, but at the same time granted visitation rights in the interest of the child. Then came Shilpa Agarwal in 2010, where a 3.5-year-old girl who was a British citizen and was moved from the UK was removed to India by the mother in contravention of British court orders. The Supreme Court directed the mother to return to the child back to UK. So this is again a flip-flop back. Then came Ravi Chandran's case in the year 2010, where the Supreme Court said that a child who was a US citizen, divorce had taken place between parties, everything had been sorted out. The mother was moving jurisdiction to jurisdiction. CBI was appointed, child was recovered, and the custody was given to the father to take the child back to USA. Then in Vikramveer Vora in 2010 again, Supreme Court said that child custody orders are always interlocutory. They are never final. They can waver, they can change from time to time on the welfare of the child. So there is no res judicata insofar child custody disputes are concerned. Now, then in 2015, Justice Lukur, in a very celebrated judgment in Surya Vadanan, came out with guidelines, as we call them, practice directions. You have seen in Shakha, practice directions gave rise to a new law. So Justice Lukur tried to create some kind of a jurisprudence, seeing that law is wavering all the time. And he laid down 3 principles. He laid down the theory of first strike, which meaning effectively that whichever country starts first will take over in terms of litigation. Second was principle of comity of courts, means courts must respect each other's orders. And the third was the jurisdiction of closest contact. Jurisdiction of closest contact meant whichever country had the closest contact with the child, the most intimate contact, would take care of the child. And he said, unless the child will be subject to moral, physical, social, cultural, sociological harm, the child must be returned promptly back to the country from where the child was born. Now, the judgment in Surya Vadanan was watered down in Nityanand Raghavan by the Supreme Court in 2017 by Justice Deepak Mishra, where they said the theory of first strike is not good, means it has no value. 2, they said There is no comity of courts principle applicable insofar child custody disputes is concerned. Courts will exercise their own jurisdiction. Foreign court order is only one consideration. And they said High Court exercises parents pater jurisdiction in child custody matters, and the remedy of habeas corpus should not be used for enforcement of foreign court orders. And they said substantive remedy should be waived off, first right principle was abolished, and summary jurisdiction of the return of the child is to be tested on the best interest principle. Now, this was followed in Pratik Gupta by the Supreme Court in 2018, and the Supreme Court said that the first right principle is not good law, notwithstanding comity of courts, doctrine of intimate contact, issue of repatriation of a child will hold good. In the process of summary adjudication, court can elect to have a summary remedy or it can hold a detailed inquiry. Doctrine of intimate contact are of persuasive relevance. And there is no application of forum convenience in wardship jurisdiction. Forum convenience is again comity of courts. And the court said, considering that the child was 2.5 years old when he came to India, and the mother is about 5 years old, child should remain in India. Child should not be dislodged from the custody of the father, while the proceedings are pending before the guardian judge. Then came Kanika Goyal. Kanika Goyal followed Raghavan and Pratik Gupta, and Supreme Court said that it is not open to contend anymore that the custody of a female minor child with her biological mother will be unlawful, and there is no presumption to the contrary. So the High Court said, and the High Court had said it is wrong, so they set aside the High Court decision and they said the child will stay with the mother as long as the proceedings are pending in the family court. Now, there is another offshoot here. You may choose to elect a remedy of child custody as an ancillary relief. How? You file a petition under Section 13 of the Hindu Marriage Act or under the Special Marriage Act for divorce. And in that you move a petition or you seek a miscellaneous relief as an ancillary relief relating to child custody under Section 26. So if you want to get over the bar of jurisdiction, which Section 9 puts in your way, the diplomatic, smart or clever way as a lawyer would be, you seek a divorce. If you have a Hindu marriage or a marriage registered in India, the place where you solemnize the marriage will have jurisdiction. So you move a petition under Section 13 for a matrimonial relief, and under 26 you seek ancillary relief. Now, as far as a petition under Section 13 is concerned, jurisdiction is guided by Section 19 of the Hindu Marriage Act in the HMA. And HMA says, one, where the place where the marriage took place, that is solemnized and registered. Two, where the parties last resided together as husband and wife. And in case the petitioner is a wife, where she is residing at the time of the petition, filing of the petition. And four is, if the person is not known or unheard of, the place where the petitioner resides. So unlike the GWA Section 9, jurisdiction under Section 13 for an ancillary petition under 26 is guided by Section 19. So that objection that the petition is no longer available, that the petition is cannot be filed just because the child doesn't live there, is no longer available to you, because the jurisdiction is guided by Section 19. So Section 9 of the GWA will not find any application under the petition filed under the Hindu Marriage Act. Now, we see a further progress in Lari Sakhamuri's case by the Supreme Court in 2019, where the Supreme Court started looking at a wider definition. Now, as a counsel who is regularly appearing in the Delhi High Court and off and on in the Supreme Court also, I started telling the court that the interest in the welfare of the child is not defined in any law. But then Section 2, subsection 9 of the Juvenile Justice, Care and Protection of Children Act 2015 defines best interest of the child. Let me give you a little background of the JJ Act. Now, the JJ Act was made in 1986, amended in 2000, in the year 2000, and again drastically amended in 2015. Why did this happen? India is a signatory to another convention called the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. Now, India acceded to this convention, and per force, India was obliged to bring in all the principles of the UNCRC into domestic law. So we made POCSO, we made Right to Compulsory Education, we made the Commission for Protection of Child Rights Act, but we also made a lot of changes in the JJ Act. Now, in JJ Act, in section 2, subsection 9, now this is a very important definition. It says the best interest of the child means the, let me give you the exact definition from the JJ Act. Now, the provision in section 2, subsection 9 of the JJ Act says that the best interest of the child means the basis for any decision taken regarding the child to ensure fulfillment of his basic rights and needs, identity, social well-being, and physical, emotional, and intellectual development. Now, I was faced with an argument that the JJ Act is not applicable to children who are having parents. Now, JJ Act applies to children in need of, children who are in conflict with law, or children who are needing adoption, or orphans, abandoned, surrendered children. But JJ Act also applies to children in need of care and protection. Now, care and protection has been defined to mean that wherever the rights of a child have been violated, maybe by a parent, it is a child in need of care and protection. So, bringing in this concept, I brought in the definition of section 2, subsection 9, and in Tippa Sri Hari, in Lahari Sakhamuri, the Supreme Court, following the judgment of the Andhra Pradesh High Court, said the expression best interest of the child, which is always to be kept in mind, is the paramount consideration, is indeed wide in its connotation, and it cannot remain the love and care of the primary caregiver, i.e. the mother, in the case of an infant or a child who's only a few years old. The definition of best interest of the child, as envisaged in section 2, subsection 9 of the JJ Act 2015, is to mean the basis for any decision taken regarding the child to ensure fulfillment of his basic rights and needs, identity, social well-being, and physical, emotional, and intellectual development. Now, let me take you to section 6 of the HMGA. Section 6 of the HMGA says, natural guardian, father and mother, but custody of a child less than 5 years of age shall be with the mother. So in Lahari Sakhamuri, the blanket right of the mother to say 5 years, less than 5 years of age, custody will be mine, has been actually dispelled by the Supreme Court in Lahari Sakhamuri to say that the expression best interest cannot remain the love and care of the primary caregiver. Now, this is a very important hurdle because most of the Indian courts say 5 years less, child goes to mother. Nothing else to be looked at. Now, this is as a lawyer for you to develop an argument that this is not a vested right. It is a right to be judged on the welfare of the child. If the mother is not a good caregiver, if the father is a better caregiver, then there is no vested right. And the custody should not be decided by a plus minus bar of 5. It should be decided on best interest in welfare. And what is best interest in welfare? The definition in 2.9. Now, we have not graduated into a concept of shared or joint custody. Now, abroad in practically every jurisdiction, there is the concept of singular custody of a parent is archaic. So whether you are separated, whether you are divorced, whether you are single or whatever, courts give equal custody, shared custody, and joint parenting, which means you divide your time so the child has both the father and the mother. But we have still to graduate, despite the Law Commission report number 257. We have still actually, Justice A.P. Shah did a lot to recommend changes in the Guardian and Wards Act and the HMGA, but legislative changes have not taken place. So this is a very serious issue. And in Vivek Singh and Romani Singh, Justice Sikri in 2017 identified what is known as the parental alienation syndrome. What happens to a child when a child is in the custody of a singular parent for a long period of time? The child, by virtue of its insecurity, develops feelings of disaffection towards the parent who is not with him because he doesn't want the child, the parent looking after him, to leave him. So this concept of the child getting psychologically imbalanced was identified by the Supreme Court in Vivek Singh versus Romani Singh as a serious psychological disorder, and which can only be addressed if there is joint parenting and joint custody. Then we see Justice Bhanumati's judgment in Tejaswini God in 2019, where she says that habeas corpus is a prerogative writ, which is an extraordinary remedy available at the discretion of the court for the welfare of the child, and it is not for to justify the legality of the custody, and it can be invoked when children are brought from foreign jurisdictions. Then we saw the last judgment, which is in period of time, is in case of Yashita Sahu, where Justice Deepak Gupta has expounded the concept that upholding the maintainability of a writ of habeas corpus, Supreme Court said it is in the when a child is in the custody of one parent, an extraordinary remedy can be invoked, and if a child is removed from one foreign country to another in violation of the orders of that court, then the Indian court ought to return the child summarily without really going into the nitty-gritties, and the jurisdiction of closest contact ought to have reference. Now, the Supreme Court here says they can order the child to return back, but they cannot force the offending parent to go. So the Supreme Court says if the offending parent doesn't want to go, then the child has to be handed over back to the other parent. And then that parent can take the child away. Now, then there is another concept which I have so sought to develop is the mirror order principle. Now, I got to effectively implement it in Jasmeet Kaur's case, where it took me 3 years to get the matter resolved. Now, this is a case where a lady brought a daughter and came for her brother's wedding, but decided to stay back, and she gave birth to another child in India. The father brought a US court order. She went under the Guardian and Wards Act. We took a jurisdiction objection. The court upheld it, dismissed her petition. She came to the High Court and lost. Then she came to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court said no, welfare has to be determined on trial. So 6-month period was given to decide the matter on merits before the family court. Meanwhile, the habeas corpus writ filed by me before the High Court succeeded. But in the habeas corpus judgment, which was decided by the Delhi High Court in 2018, the Delhi High Court said we will only direct the return of the child if you get all these conditions which we are putting for the return implemented or made a part of the order in the US court. And these were: the father will not separate the children from mother, the father will not file a criminal petition, or he will not pursue criminal charges because child abduction is a federal offense in the US. The father will provide maintenance and facilities for the child, for the wife and the children. He will deposit $25,000 in an escrow account, and he will fund her litigation to a partial extent also. It was a very difficult task prevailing over the US court, but the US court accepted all that and modified its order and put all those conditions and appointed a lawyer also to be act as an escrow. And we got the order back, and the Delhi High Court Delhi High Court ultimately said, you can now take children back. So effectively, the conditions imposed by the Delhi High Court were accepted by the US court. This is what is a mirror order. So this is an order reflecting in another jurisdiction. Mirror orders are a common jurisprudence abroad, but in India we don't find acceptance because every court decides on its own merits. Now, in Jasmeet Kaur's case, ultimately the lady went to Supreme Court. So there were 2 decisions by then. One in the trial court, we succeeded in the trial court on merits also. We succeeded in the High Court in the appeal also. We succeeded in the habeas corpus. Ultimately, this matter landed up before a bench of Justice Indu Malhotra and Justice Lalit and Justice Hemant Gupta, where this 2-1, the matter was resolved. The lady was asked to go back to the US, and same conditions which the Delhi High Court imposed were reimposed, and mirror order jurisprudence was born. Then subsequently in Smriti Madan Kansagra, the Supreme Court, in a more detailed judgment in 2019 by Justice Indu Malhotra and Justice Lalit, ordered the return of a child to Kenya, provided all the conditions set down in the order of the Supreme Court were made part of the US court, the African court proceedings. So we have now seen a mirror order jurisprudence being born in the Indian jurisprudence, but as of now, it is a one-way ticket. We are asking foreign courts to make Indian court orders a part of their order. But where are we in terms of mirror orders? Suppose I am regularly asked by foreign courts or foreign lawyers as an expert, if we get a mirror order from US, Canada, England, America, will an Indian court accept the mirror order and return the child mechanically? The answer is no. Because the principle we follow under the Guardian and Wards Act or the HMGA is best interest in welfare. So if the woman says, I'm not going back, it is not in the best interest. The foreign court order will not be mechanically applied. We will test it. We will go into it. We will examine it. And then we will take a call whether to return the child or not. Now, there is another decision in Nilanjan Bhattacharya where in 2020, where the Supreme Court ordered the return of the child. The Karnataka High Court had imposed conditions on the pandemic issue, but the Supreme Court, Justice Chandrachud, says that there is no bar, the child has to go back. So, where are we today? So, following Lahari Sakhamuri, Yashita Sahu, Jasmeet Kaur, habeas corpus is a remedy which is maintainable. Whether you succeed or not is going to be a decision on facts. The court will go into merits insofar welfare of the child by a summary inquiry. You may be even remanded to go to the family court. You may get a return order or there may be a refusal. There may be a refusal if the petition under 26 is concerned. So, effectively, the parent's pater jurisdiction is what is exercised. Now, going back to Jasmeet Kaur, where the concept of temporary residence under Section 9 has been expounded, they are very clearly differing from the Punjab Haryana High Court and agreeing with 6 other high courts held that the temporary residence of the mother is not the residence of the child. Child's ordinary residence will be determined by where the child habitually and permanently resides. Then the next principle we follow is welfare of the children supersedes parental rights. So no parent has a vested right to say child is my custody, child is his custody. The child will remain in the custody of the parent whose best interest and welfare is there. Now, a question may also arise as arose in a matter before the Delhi High Court, whether a parent can be accused of kidnapping his or her own child. Now, in this matter of the Delhi High Court, the Delhi High Court registered a case where a father had moved the child to a foreign jurisdiction in a very surreptitious way, violating Delhi High Court orders. The Delhi High Court ordered a case under 361, 363 IPC and held to be kidnapping. But the order was stayed by the Supreme Court. The matter ultimately on child custody was heavily debated. I fought for the father, and in that case, I was able to succeed to the extent of convincing the court that there is no kidnapping involved. The matter is still to be gone into on merits. But the Supreme Court, in a very illuminating judgment, defining the jurisdiction of the family court and how the matter is to be dealt with, held that unless there is a substantive petition, now in this case, The father had filed a guardianship petition, but he removed the child. The mother came to the court and said, transpose me as the petitioner. The court permitted that, and on the same day, the court accepted her affidavit and granted her the custody, singular custody, without serving the opposite counsel. So I told the court that this procedure is violative of the principles laid down, and the Supreme Court agreed with me. And in a well-written judgment, Justice Khanvelkar has upheld that the substantive procedure of the Guardian and Watch Act cannot be done away with. It has to be essentially complied with. So then, what happens if a parent is removed, child is removed? So, irrespective of the child remaining in custody of one parent, the natural rights of the other parent as a guardian cannot be taken away. A parent cannot say that because I have the custody, therefore I am the guardian. So, irrespective of the fact that a parent has lost the custody of the child, his or her rights as a natural guardian cannot be taken away. Now, no court can say that the other parent is unfit or not considered to be appointed as a guardian unless there is a declaration by the court under section 19 of the Guardian and Wards Act that the parent is an unfit person. Now, for declaring a person unfit, the court has to come to a conclusion as to how and why the parent is unfit, and we cannot make a blanket disregard of that condition. Now, what progress have we made on Indian law? So we have the Law Commission report number 257 talking about the reforms and guardianship custody laws dated 22nd of May 2015. Now, it has recommended major changes in the Guardian and Wards Act, and it has given supporting bills. Now, the issue of joint custody, shared parenting has been developed a lot in this by pending schedules to the acts as a proposal to amend, but nothing has happened. The bills remain as they are. Now, there is another very interesting offshoot. I was an amicus for 12 long years in a matter in the Punjab and Haryana High Court, where a child had been removed by an aunt, violating the custody rights of the parents. She forged a passport and got herself declared as a mother and took the child to UK while the custody dispute was pending in revision before the High Court. So the High Court appointed me as an amicus. We tried everything in the book to bring the child back. The child was in England, but we were not successful. At one point, the child was apprehended. The child was found with an uncle and taken into custody, but the child again vanished from the school by a surreptitious removal. The child was never returned. So the Honorable Judge Justice D. Balla, before remitting office, wanted to conclude the matter. So I gave him a report on child and custody laws in India. And my report and the judgment was forwarded by the judge to the Law Commission. The Law Commission in turn came out with another report and recommended to the government that we should do something about it. So ultimately, the long and short of it was that the Government of India, Ministry of Women and Child Development Welfare, constituted a 12-member committee of 6 judges and 6 government officers. I was also co-opted on the committee. And we, in the year 2017, we came out with a report. But there is also a Law Commission report prior to that, Law Commission report number 218. This is the need for India to accede to the Hague Convention. So in our report, we heard a lot of left behind parents. We did a lot of interactions with parents worldwide, parents who were abroad and who were not in contact with the children. So our multi-member committee ultimately gave a report. And in the report, we recommended that there should be a protection of children, Inter-Country Removal and Retention Bill 2018. Now, in this bill, we have defined what is child removal, how the child removal should go by, and what we need to do. But all this is still in limbo. There is no statute. So what is the status today? We are governed by ad hoc decisions. of the Supreme Court. 1984, Surinder Kaur. 1987, thereafter, flip-flop. Then again 2015 flip-flop, 2018, 2019. So we keep wavering and we keep jumping up and down. Now, I, as an amicus, whenever I'm called upon to assist, I've given you one of my latest reports and a report which I've given to a foreign court recently as an opinion. I always recommend now that no singular custody should be awarded. There should be joint parenting. A parenting plan should be prepared. Now, the problem is, under what provision of law do you make a parenting plan? Now, this is a flexibility available only to the family court. The most flexible law in the entire jurisprudence in family law is the Family Courts Act. Now, the Family Courts Act 1984 is such a well-drafted legislation that the family court judge is a judge in his own rights. The family court can devise its own procedure. It is not bound by the constraints of CPC or the Evidence Act. So, irrespective of the technicalities of the law of evidence, any document can be taken in evidence, irrespective of whether it satisfies the requirements of technicality of being put as an exhibit under the Evidence Act or the CPC. The family court is also free to devise its own procedure. So, which means that the family court can cut short its method. It can take affidavits by way of evidence and cross-examination can be done thereafter. I do mostly, this is what I do in family courts. I don't, for examination in chief, I file the affidavit of the witness in advance, circulate the copy to the opposite side. It saves time. And then the witness can be cross-examined by the other side based on the contents of the affidavit. And at the spot, I can put in documents. If documents are objected to, the family court can overrule the objection and take the document as an exhibit, irrespective of whether it is an exhibit under the Evidence Act or not. Because the family court is free to devise its own procedure. Because it is aimed at conciliation and settlement, the family court has got this flexibility. Now, this flexibility can do wonders. But at the same time, the family courts cannot, under this power of devising its own procedure, change the substantive procedure of the Family Courts Act and transpose and do all kinds of things. Because the Supreme Court now says that this can be done. Now, the case is Aman Lohiya's case. You will find the judgment. It's of 2020. The Supreme Court says that you can't replace the substantive procedure as a discretion of yours to change its procedure, the procedure available to you. You have to first satisfy the substantive provision of filing a petition, having a written statement, having evidence, and then you can devise your own procedure. You can't change the substantive procedure of filing of the petition. You can only change the procedure of adjudication. So this is one minor rider which the Supreme Court has developed. So the long and short of it, Aman Lohia, was that a parent as a natural guardian cannot be labeled as a kidnapper or an abductor, and this right can only be adjudicated by the concerned parent as far as that is concerned. Now, the bottom line is, if I am asked by a foreign court, will there be a mechanical application? Will there be a application simpliciter by a foreign court order of return? The answer is no. In the habeas corpus, the court may say, we are going to decide the matter on merits. We are not going to implement the foreign court order. Thereafter, they may return the child by a summary inquiry or detailed inquiry, or they may relegate the matter to the family court. It is a total discretion. There is no hard and fast rule, and therefore, there is no concept of implementation of foreign court judgment straight away. Now, you also have a presumption. So now, if there is a final order of a foreign court, then you have to follow section 13 of the CPC. 13 of the CPC says when foreign judgments are conclusive. And the exceptions laid down are if it has not been pronounced by a court of competent jurisdiction, where it has not been given the merits of the case, where it appears on the face of the proceedings to be founded in the incorrect view of international law, where the proceedings are opposed to natural justice, where it has been obtained by fraud, and where the claim is unfounded on a breach of any law and force in India. So these reasons can defeat it. Now, there is also a cross mix of an inflow of judgments of matrimonial courts from foreign courts, which have a reflection here, which is judgments based on breakdown of marriage or irretrievable breakdown of marriage in a foreign court. Now, under the Hindu Marriage Act and the Special Marriage Act, we have a fault-based theory. We have divorce by mutual consent also. But irretrievable breakdown of marriage is not a ground for divorce. So our courts have said that if you have a foreign court decree based on irretrievable breakdown of marriage, that is not going to be good law in India. So therefore, if you have a breakdown of marriage abroad and a Hindu marriage is dissolved, you may be divorced in US, but you will still be married in India. I invariably opine to people that if you divorce in a foreign jurisdiction and you are agreeable to do a divorce in India, do a divorce by mutual consent in India also and dissolve the marriage. You need not appear. Courts are liberal now. You can file petitions through a power of attorney. He can identify you by video conferencing. Your consent can be given by video conferencing. Your final consent can also be given by video conferencing. And without appearance of parties, a mutual consent divorce can be granted. But obviously, this is not possible in a contested divorce proceeding. So, friends, this is the long and short of this bird's eye view of child custody disputes, which are hotly debated, which have difficulty in expounding. I have seen senior lawyers grapple with the problem to say a habeas corpus doesn't lie. But that is an archaic concept. We have to change with times. Seeing Yashita Sahu, seeing Subhan Kodali, seeing the judgments of the Supreme Court now, Lahari Sakamuri, Nityanand Raghavan, Pratik Gupta, habeas corpus is maintainable. It may be stopped if there is a custody dispute pending and the matter may be relegated to the custody court. But this jurisprudence, which has been developed substantially by the Supreme Court, is a bird's eye view of what the law will be. Now, I will leave it to you to ask whatever questions you have and whatever issues you have in your mind. If you have a viewpoint, feel free. If you have a question, develop it, or any other way you wish to have it. So the floor is open to you.
I think I will. Okay, Tushar, please go ahead.
No, you have to start. You can start. Tushar has raised his hand. Tushar wants to say something. Yeah, Tushar.
Maybe
yourself.
I'll ask the first question.
Yeah, please.
I've come across cases where there is a conflict between a foreign court and an Indian court on what is the best interest assessment. Because this can be a culturally driven understanding to what is best interest, and there's always a scope for a huge divergence. Many other jurisdictions have tried to legislatively kind of give parameters for what is best interest, but definitely you don't find that in India. So I sort of guess that there would be scope for tension. Have you come across cases of tension?
Yes,
how the tension has been on principle and how this is resolved?
See, sometimes there are very rigid stands. The European, American, or foreign concept of best interest is you can't look after the child, you cannot discipline the child, you cannot do this, you cannot do that. They take the child away and put the child in foster care. Even if both parents are there, you're hitting the child, slapping the child, you are admonishing the child, you are not looking after the child, you are not doing this, you are not doing that. Now, in India, our parameter is different. We allow disciplining, we allow parenting, we allow shared parenting, we allow extended parenting in the sense that uncles, aunts, grandparents step in. So these are social services, foster services in the Indian jurisprudence. Now, these are very difficult for a foreign court to understand. Cultural clashes. Why does a child sleep with you? Why doesn't the child sleep on its own? Now, this is something unimaginable to them. Why do you need to have the child all the time in your lap? Why is the child not going to school? And in the school, if the teacher finds something abnormal, the child will be reported. So these parameters of social, cultural, and religious issues are often in conflict. So this has given rise to a new breed of litigation, anti-injunction suits. So whenever there are parallel proceedings on the same custody issue between two jurisdictions, one parent in India files an anti-injunction suit, and following Modi entertainment, courts have started interfering also. So it is a question of forum convenience, which is the most convenient forum, which is the best forum. And then we fall back to the elementary principle which India has followed consistently from 1984 to 2021. Jurisdiction which has the closest and most intimate contact should decide. So if a child is born in India, though may have gone abroad, child is in an Indian cosmopolitan family structure, then child custody should be decided. Now, parents tend to say, my child is an American citizen. My dispute will be decided in America. Now, here our personal law steps in. Now, Hindu law travels on you on your back. It has extraterritorial application. So your becoming American, Canadian, Britisher has no value, because your religious law, your personal law will apply to you on matters of custody. So I can turn around and say, my child is a Hindu child, my child may be a British, American, or Canadian national. My custody will be decided in accordance with Indian principles laid down in Indian law. So there may be a clash. This is where comity of courts steps in. But then when comity of courts doesn't work, you often find the foreign court going one way and the Indian court going one way. And the problem is, whoever has the custody of the child wins. Because there is a clash. You cannot implement an Indian order in a foreign jurisdiction. You cannot implement a foreign order in an Indian jurisdiction. Mirror orders are the only way it can work. Now, the Hague Conference has developed a network, a Hague network of judges to do resolution. So a judge can pick up a telephone or send an email to another judge and say, let us resolve this. But we have not joined that network, so we suffer. That's the sad part. And if you have an intelligent judge, he can wriggle out. But if the judge is conventional, outmoded, and doesn't have perception or vision, then, and one very important factor, assistance. Lawyers' assistance is a big input. And sadly, lawyers at the family court, trial court level are not really equipped sometimes to handle these issues. I am often stepping in because people think that I replace senior lawyers at times because they think they don't have the expertise. See, we don't have a specialist family law bar. We don't have a dedicated family law judiciary like most jurisdictions abroad. So we have not developed it. I have, over a period of 35 years, been to Australia, America, Canada, all over Europe, and seen international perspectives. Australia has a Chief Justice of the Family Court of Australia. They have their own regime. There are 2,000 lawyers. And they have a very heavy arbitration and mediation and settlement issue. But in India, who agrees to mediation? Who agrees to settlement? Unless there is a whip of the judge, nobody bothers. So this is a gray area. And unless we make a statute, and unless we define the law, and unless we define the parameters, resolution will not come. We are internally in conflict. Every time the Supreme Court is changing its view every 5 years. So where do the courts go? So maybe sometime more, I guess.
I have a follow-up question too.
Yes.
What are the reasons why we are hesitant to accede to the Hague Convention?
See, the biggest hesitation I saw when I sat with 6 judges and 6 government officers were that they say we don't want to surrender to the foreign courts. It's a very parochial and a very sort of a degraded thinking, you are not surrendering to a foreign court. There are, in the Hague Convention also, there are exceptions to return. You can make your domestic law. I prevailed over them. You know, I was accused of being an American agent because America wants the convention to be signed. So you see, if you have to grow, you have to widen your network. Unfortunately, the government doesn't look at it seriously. The government only looks at laws which make money. Also look at arbitration. From 1940 to 2020, we have changed so much because it is fiscal. In child custody, nobody bothers. Children are non-issues. They are not votes. So nobody bothers. See, unless we grow, unless we think big, unless we grow into a framework, we have signed the Convention on Adoptions. We have signed the Convention on the Rights of the Child. What is the problem in signing the Abduction Convention? We almost succeeded in 2007. Anand Sharma was the minister. I remember we were there with dignitaries from the Hague, the Secretary General. He said we will have to take it to the committee which takes the calls on whether we have to sign. And once it is done, we will sign it. But then the government fell, elections were announced, everything went back. This government has no tendency to agree to it because they say we will surrender to foreign courts. You will not lose your jurisdiction. And come to think of it, see, you may be a high-end scientist, a top IT person, a professional doctor, and a very high-end financial analyst. But when it comes to child custody, it can ruin your mind. I've seen people go berserk because they can't come to India and the mother is sitting with the child in India. So if there is emotional instability or there is no peace at home, you will not grow in terms of your profession and you will not be able to contribute to the system. So if you want inflow, if you want free flow of children, you have to allow flexibility. Now today, what is the grave reality? No foreign court anywhere in the world will let a child come to India when there is a dispute. I gave evidence in a Canadian court. And the way, you know, there was an American lawyer appearing opposite me saying India takes years to decide, India is a corrupt system, India is slow, India hasn't signed the convention, you can never get out, there are outmoded laws, there is domestic violence, cruelty, and there is dowry and whatnots. And you know, there was a Canadian lawyer cross-examining me, and my turn came. And he told the judge, he says he's not competent to depose because I spoke very freely that India is not that bad, law is different now. The Canadian lawyer told the judge he is not competent to be an expert on Indian law because he has never appeared before a Canadian court. I told the judge, this is ridiculous. I said, you have an American lawyer who has no degree in Indian law, commenting on Indian law. And I'm an Indian lawyer with 36 years behind me, 9 books, and extensive appearances abroad. And the judge dismissed the objection. But the point is, look at the mindset abroad. India is projected as a land where matters never get decided. And India is a haven for child abduction. So this projection is very wrong. And lawmakers have to grow out of their colonial setup and they have to start understanding systems. Justice Vikramjit Sen was a part of the Hague Convention of Judges and he used to attend meetings. But after that, nobody got appointed and our connection is missing. So we are losing out. I don't know. I've been working on it for 35 years. The closest I've got to is in the report now. But when will it become an act? Who knows? So now we go again back to you. So Tushar, you wanted to say something?
Yes, sir. So I had 2 questions. One of them was very similar to what Mahesh sir asked. That was surrounding the conflict. Yeah, that was surrounding the conflict of law issues which are surrounding it. You explained it very well. My second question pertains to the parenting plan. When you were talking about joint custody and the concept of parenting plan. So my question was like, you told us that it's very difficult here, and with some of the best practices that you actually mentioned right now that Australia and Canada do have. So what is your take on the parenting plan? How could this be adopted? the practice of parenting plan in India and what's there in practice about this?
See, I did a rundown with the Maharashtra family code. Bombay, there is a dedicated family code bar because in Bandra you have all the family codes together, 12 of them. So they asked me, what do we do? I said, listen, you have a very flexible system of adjudication under the Family Courts Act. I said, the judge is free to devise his own procedure. So why don't you people make a proposal that the court should direct both sides to submit a joint parenting plan and the court can cull out the best. And they came up with another proposal that there should be child lawyers. There should be mediators or amicus. The Family Courts Act again permits amicus lawyers to be appointed. So I said, why don't you get in the child lawyer concept in and let the child lawyer take over the coining of the concept. So essentially, because there is no statutory provision in the Guardian and Wards Act, the Law Commission report did recommend, but it never became law. This proposal to draft a joint parenting plan can emerge in the family court if the judge has the wisdom to develop its jurisprudence. But at the same time, you often find in Supreme Court judgments that the Supreme Court comes in and says, this is a parenting plan, Monday to Friday, father, weekends, mother. Or father is abroad, child is in the hostel, father will visit the child in this period, mother will visit the child in this period. So these kind of flexible things can come in only with the intervention of the court. So you need the support of the court, very basically. Or you need good lawyers, or you need very free-minded judges to say, well, let's look at joint parenting. Now, in Navtej Singh's case, it's very clear that the best interest of the child doesn't lie with one parent. I have stopped arguing that I want the child to go back. I always say I want the mother or the father also to go back. I want to go back, and I want the court there to devise a time how the child will get both parents. We have to grow out of our thinking. This singular concept destroys the child. I did my first child abduction matter way back in 1986. A lady came, a British lady of Punjabi origin came, filed a habeas corpus. We found the man, he produced a child, but then he vanished. So I got a roving writ issued by the High Court saying, adjourned sine die, come back whenever you find the child. The lady looked for the child for 10 long years. Ultimately, after 15 years, she found the child in America. She brought the child back and reared him. Recently, some time ago, the child got married. But you will be surprised. The child, when he got married as a grown-up adult, invited his father, and her mother did not even know that he was getting married. So he accuses the mother of separating him from his father. So single children brought up by single parents can sometimes find themselves to be in very strange complexities and very strange mental issues, that they have been deprived the love and care of the other parent. So singular parenting custody is not a good idea, but it is the judiciary which has to take a call on this. They have to seriously consider maybe practice directions like the Shakha in some case. If the legislature is not interested, Law Commission report is not to be looked into, then something the courts have to do. You will find judgments of the Bombay High Court on this. Justice Tushar Obale is one judgment by Justice Mridula Bhatkar, where she says, what is family? It's beautifully done. Family word is father, F, and a, mother, M, I, L, love you. So he says family means father and mother, I love you. Now look at the expounding by the judge. So you need a very open-minded court actually. But sadly, judges at that level don't have that IQ, that intellect, or that comprehension. I do a lot in trying to improve things in the Judicial Academy in Bhopal. See, younger lot of judges is good, but anybody who's crossed 55, his concepts are different. And you're caught up in your social thinking and your personal perceptions. that child should always remain with the mother. Now, these kind of things are not very relevant in today's times. In abroad, you talk about this, they think something is wrong with you. So I guess we need time to change. Next.
Sahil, you could go ahead.
So,
Yes, Yes,
I
yes.
was wondering, like, can a parent change the citizenship of a child? So, for example, if father has the sole custody of the child and mother has the visitation right, and father takes his son to United States or to any other country, so can he change the citizenship of the child?
See, ordinarily speaking, no country will allow a single parent to change the nationality of the child unless the other parent is consenting. The only exception the country will take is that if you have an order of a court of your country giving you sole custody, then you may be in a position. But again, then there may be roadblocks. There is a lot of problem in this. See, when children are brought to India, what the other parent tries to do is to ensure that the child can stay in India indefinitely. The parent tries to obtain an overseas citizen of India card. OCI is a citizenship issue. It's a secondary citizenship issue by which a lifelong entry into India is available and stays available if you are born to Indian parents or you qualify for Indian citizenship. So the question comes when a mother or a father brings a child to India, visa is expired, so the parent applies for an OCI. So the government of India says get the signatures of the other parent, and if the signatures of the other parent are not there, then you have to get a custody order. Now sometimes Indian citizenship is there. I saw this in a matter. Mother tried to surrender the Indian citizenship and take the American citizenship. Now, American law also says unless you have a custody order or an explicit order of the court permitting you to do so, we will not give American citizenship. So, by and large, this is not permissible unless you play hanky-panky. I did a case where a mother brought a child to India from Dubai. The child had a German passport. She went to the embassy and said, "Oh, my child is Indian. Passport is lost." So she came on a travel document and she actually got an Indian passport in Delhi. Now, dual citizenship is prohibited. Article 9 of the Constitution and Section 9 of the Citizenship Act says no dual citizenship. But then, in the case of the child, the Citizenship Act says that a child can elect to have a passport of his or her choice when the child turns 18. But as a blanket rule, you cannot hold two passports of two different countries as an Indian citizen. It is violative of law. You have to surrender the Indian passport to take a foreign passport. And relinquishment of Indian citizenship automatically disentitles you to Indian citizenship status. You may get an OCI, but you disqualify for Indian citizenship. So that's some in substance of your answer. So Mridul, you are the only one left.
Sir, I had a question regarding this parents patriot jurisdiction. So, when does this parents patriot jurisdictions come in? As in, when the petition itself is filed, the court assumes the jurisdiction, then goes forward, or during the proceeding, it seems that yes, it is necessary to assume that jurisdiction. When does that kicks in?
Parents patriot jurisdiction emerges or is born the moment the child is in the jurisdiction of the court. So if it is a Delhi High Court, the moment the child is physically present in Delhi, parents patriot jurisdiction is born. But it is invoked or it is brought into practice or effectuated when the petition is filed. So from the day the petition is filed, it is recognized. So if the other side comes and says, this High Court has no jurisdiction, because the child is a foreign national, because the child is being brought here in violation of a foreign court order, or because the child doesn't live here, the High Court can turn around and say, no, the child is in our jurisdiction. By virtue of the physical presence of the child in our jurisdiction, we have assumed the mantle and the role of a guardian, the parents portray. That is how it is born. Now, I have also started encountering cases where people say, child was in Delhi, child has been taken away to London. Please file a habeas corpus. I have never attempted it, but I find it very difficult to tell a High Court, please exercise parents' jurisdiction. The answer is very simple. The High Court will exercise jurisdiction, parents portray, if the child is within its jurisdiction. If the child is taken away from the physical jurisdiction of a court to a foreign country, can the High Court take its jurisdiction abroad? Answer is no. This happened in a matter I did in the High Court of Punjab and Haryana, where there was a dispute between two parents of Punjabi origin and Canadian nationality. The High Court ordered them to go back, but the High Court also ordered strict conditions that you will report back, child will regularly be brought back. So the single judge tried to push his jurisdiction to Canada. The order was appealed, and the division bench said, child is no longer in your jurisdiction. Your jurisdiction comes to an end the moment the child is out of your jurisdiction. So this is how the concept of parents portray works. But then Ruchi Maju says, whether you have jurisdiction otherwise in law or not, parents portray comes in. So unlike a guardian judge who has jurisdiction only if the child ordinarily resides to pass an order, High Court is not bound by that parameter. Why? Because 226 is an extraordinary jurisdiction. It is a jurisdiction beyond the statute. It is a very vibrant concept which we have coined in our system, addressed to life and liberty. So I can do anything, pass any order, unlike a guardian judge who is bound by the shackles of Section 9. If he finds he has no jurisdiction under Section 9, that is the end of the story. So this is the beauty of habeas corpus. Sunil Batra has expounded it to a great extent that a habeas corpus can even be monitored or follow up. So it is actually addressed to the liberty, life and liberty. And for a child, 1960, read 1960 Gohar Begum short judgment was very clear. Neil Ratan Kundu expounded in American and British law, very clear. Welfare. So under the stick of a welfare, you can invoke your parents' portray to whatever limit you want, but within the jurisdiction. But Supreme Court has parents portray all over India. See, read Ravi Chandran. You can throw anything anywhere. This is how it works.
Thank you, sir.
Yes, next question, please.
We have one more question. Chitra, who's my colleague.
Thank you, Mr. Malhotra, and my apologies that I'm not turning my video on.
No problem.
I wanted to ask about what was happening with the mediation cell that the Ministry of Women and Child Development had set up in order to address these disputes, these very disputes, as a sort of a halfway house, not joining the Hague Conference. I know Justice Vikramjit Sen was part of the Malta process.
Seem to know quite a lot about it. Are you a lawyer?
I am a lawyer.
Where are you practicing?
I don't practice much anymore. I don't go to court. I teach at the Daksha Fellowship.
Okay, very good question. You see, according to me, what the WCD has done is just a half-baked potato. Now, they have talked of this mediation cell and they have pushed it to the NCPCR. You must be aware of it, National Commission for Protection of Child Rights.
Yes.
Now, the Americans came to me and said, it's a very good initiative and it's going to work very well. We have 200 cases of child removal pending and we are going to use this mediation. Now, you tell me, when child abduction has gone to a stage where you have entered litigation and you have, so to say, been in litigation for, say, 2 years, 3 years, or 5 years, attitudes have hardened so much. and the parent with the custody in India refuses to go back, I don't think mediation works anymore. I have seen very bitter issues when we did the uh, discussions on online on when we were looking at the Hague Committee was looking into all this. Now let us suppose the mediation cell passes some kind of a understanding or a direction to say, well, child will be given access, other parent will be provided visitation, and so on and so forth. Now you tell me, how are you going to enforce the order? Unless there is a hand of a court effectively monitoring it or using a penal provision saying, all right, if you don't give custody, you don't give visitation, you will get no maintenance. And likewise, a parent wants visitation or access, court says you pay, we'll give you reciprocity. So because the mediation has no stick, because the mediation under the auspices of the NCPCR, which is not a court. See, what is the commission? It's a commission. It doesn't have the powers of the judicial court. So the fact that the mediation is not effectively enforceable, I think it loses its sting. I have yet to see a single success of the NCPCR coming out. And there is another practical problem with the NCPCR. You see, the NCPCR is full of people who are non-judicial backgrounds. I filed a petition in the Punjab and Haryana High Court on behalf of NCPCR, and 9th of April 2013, a judgment came by Justice Sikri and Justice R.K. Jain, where the court said the chairpersons of the commission should be retired judges. And I said this is very necessary because they're all quasi-judicial powers. If you appoint a lay person, I'm not accusing anybody of being a politician and not acquainted with law. But if you're not acquainted with the administration of justice or understanding of laws as a law practitioner, you cannot really function. Now the NCPCR or all the state commissions are full of people who have no knowledge of law, and they are actually empowered. You look at the Commission for Protection of Child Rights Act, it has vast powers. The commission has got powers much more than the High Court, but they don't know their powers, they don't understand their powers, they don't know how to implement them. You will have a secretary level officer asking the commission members to come and meet him, and they're all sitting outside waiting. I tell them, you're constitutional law appointees. You are appointees under the statute. You don't have to accept this behavior. So because there is no understanding of laws, there is no actual implementation of laws, and because there is no actual power of the mediation, to me it appears to be a failure. This is what I think. This is my take on it. And I don't agree that this is going to be helpful. Why doesn't the ministry think of signing the convention? You have your safeguards, develop a system, create a central authority. We have done it in adoptions. We have created CARA. We have regulated everything in such a systematic way, and everything works beautifully. Why not have a parallel of CARA as a central authority, have a judge there who will administer things, who will take the matter to court, get it resolved. So I think legislation in the field and making your authorities with judicial powers is necessary. The mediation, I think, is a failure.
Thank you, Mr. Mani.
For reactions, please feel free. If you agree or disagree with me,
I think for me, I am also a mediator. And for me, the bigger difficulty is that we have no information about what is happening in that cell.
Absolutely. Because we don't believe in facts and figures. Nobody wants to recognize how many children are removed. Nobody wants to make data about what to do. Nobody wants to record its proceedings. Nobody wants to give you any information. And I think the NCPCR is doing too many things. For them, this mediation business is not a priority. And another very important thing, do you have people trained as mediators in the mediation cell?
My understanding is no.
Are they laypersons? I think they're all laypersons. Some of them are bureaucrats. Some of them are politicians. Some of them are favorites accommodated as members who have absolutely no clue on what to do. With such ill-equipped people, I don't think you can expect anything.
Thank you, Mr. Malhotra.
Yeah, I did not even know that the NCPCR had such a thing, despite working on child rights and kind of regularly following what the NCPCR does. You don't find this in any report, in anything that they do. It's just
I was a court-appointed inspection head. See, there was a very serious case of child abuse in Haryana about 10 years ago. And there was a lady, I remember her name was Jaswanti, and she was running a child home in Rohtak, very 1 kilometer away from the chief minister's house. And she was doing pedophilia, she was doing rape, selling children, abortions, you name it, and she was doing it. So some children ran away and they went to NCPCR. There was a very enlightened member, Mr. Tikku, who is no more. So he took notice and he opened an inquiry. Then the matter reached the High Court. I was appointed to go and interview all the children. There were 110 children in 5 different jurisdictions. And I, along with 3 other lawyers, went and we gave a report. It was horrifying. She used to feed white. Everybody wanted powder. So we asked her, what is this powder? So she used to feed heroin and narcotics. Deaf, dumb, handicapped. She would force them to be raped, and then she would sell the children. She would watch the things, and there were orgies. Such a muck. We gave the report. The matter was referred to CBI. The CBI investigated. She was convicted. She never even got bail. And every child deposed, despite handicaps. So that led me to, I went back to the Commission for Protection of Child Rights in Delhi and I said, listen, you should get commissions in Haryana, Punjab and Chandigarh. We filed a petition. The NCPCR filed a petition. The judgment is reported at NCPCR versus State of Haryana. And we got commissions in Punjab, Haryana and Chandigarh. Now, when these commissions came up, there was a judge to be appointed. So they took it to Supreme Court and said, no, judge should not be appointed. So they will dilute. Now, when these Punjab Haryana commissions were formed, the members were persons, they would come to me and say, hum kya kare? What do we do? So I said, study the act. Oh, samajh nahi aata ji. Pata nahi. So I wondering, what are they doing? The people who are to be appointed, there is a High Court judge who has to select all these persons, but who follows the procedure? So they have no idea. If you look at the powers of the commissions, there are commissions in every state. There is an NCPCR in Delhi. They have vast powers. But what do? See, if the chairperson is a politician, what comprehension do you expect? They may be doing good things, but I think if you want them to implement POCSO, if you want them to implement right to compulsory education, if you want them to implement other child rights issues, effectively, if there is a sort of a power given to them, let us say by a Supreme Court judgment, all child custody disputes can go to NCPCR. But then the question is CPCR equipped to handle it? Is there a person who will understand the judicial issues? No. I think you need at least a retired High Court judge, because you need that judicial training. Unless you have that, you have created the law, but you have not put the infrastructure or the mechanism to implement the law. This is where we fail. So how many cases do commissions take up suo moto? 0.
I once did an informal study on it, and the conclusion was only that these suo moto cases are largely very politically driven.
Obviously. So he is meant to vindicate a politician of party X or party Y, or to settle a personal score or a grievance with a person.
And then there are state commissions taking cognizance to prevent the National Commission from taking cognizance, especially when there are politically sensitive issues involved.
Problem is, you are not appointing the right people. A person with a judicial training, a judicial background will not do this. irrespective of the constraints on it. By and large, things will not go that bad. See the ruin in orphanages, see the ruin in shelter homes. In the north, it is a very common practice to leave a child in a home. If you think the child will get very good education and food and upbringing, but you don't know the abuse the child will face. We found a home in Gurgaon where the cook who was affected by AIDS was raping all the children. Sick, the worst. Nobody bothers. And every child welfare home is supposed to be registered. But there are so many unregistered places and children are cramped like animals just because you get grants. There is no mechanism of checks. There is a child welfare committee, there is a state level committee. But who's interested? The worst is you appoint ex officio, Mr. X IES, Mr. Y PCS, Mr. H HCS to be ex officio member. You think he's bothered about what is going on? He has no inclination, no energy, no IQ, no time. So it's a waste of the effort. Child laws are a poor priority. That's the problem. That's about it.
Right. Any other questions? Okay. I have to say thank you so much, sir, for many things, for taking time out from your schedule, despite other pressing concerns, that you actually pressed yourself to give us this lecture.
I will be indisposed and out of action for the next 2 weeks. You know why?
Yes.
So this is light because I have postponed what I had to be done. So why not part with knowledge which others will gain? And I'm very happy that these people are young lawyers who have today got a bird's eye view. And with the material I've circulated, if you face a challenge in a petition, you can read it and analyze it and actually do it. We need family law lawyers. We need practitioners. You can teach the judge, you can learn from the judge, and you can settle law.
Also, for in this short span of an hour and a half, actually giving that bird's eye view and guiding them through the key set of legal issues as well as practical concerns. I would say that it is nearly impossible to do this normally, and it was a short, sweet, punched session that we had. Thank you very much, sir, for doing this. We hope
Mahesh, I personally feel law practitioners who ought to be doing this are not doing this. I was very fondly associated with Mr. Soli Sarabji, Mr. Anil Dewan, Mr. Arda Junia, Mr. P.P. Rao. We were lawyers, we would go in groups to foreign jurisdictions as practitioners, and these people would take part in conferences. They taught us. But sadly, in our profession, those lawyers are gone, and we have not brought in the new ones. Today, Mr. X, Mr. Y, Mr. Z is only interested in 10 to 25 lakhs per appearance in the Supreme Court. He hasn't got time for all this. So these are the people who should be teaching. These are the people who should be contributing to the. We are not building the profession. We are not putting in the profession. I personally feel, after having traveled everywhere in the world, I should now just teach, lecture, and practice and assist. I must put back in the system what the system has given me. And this is a duty, sadly, we are lacking in our profession.
Absolutely, sir. I think it's quite surprising that we don't have any requirement for continuing legal education to keep the license to practice. There is also a bigger disconnect between the legal academia and the world of practitioners. Very few teachers of law have actually ever even stepped into a courtroom or done a transaction themselves. So the disconnect is huge. So part of the idea of the Aksha Fellowship was exactly that. So Chitra was an active practitioner. I practiced for some time before moving to the academia. And most of our teachers are a mix of people from practice and from academia. And we hope that Sai University is a very young university. We are building our own law school.
I have a suggestion for you, Mahesh. I am an adjunct professor at Symbiosis in Pune for 3 years. And I teach private international law or international family law to LLM, and I give specialist lectures to LLB students. And I've done about 25 or 30 lectures in this year. So you must evolve courses, electives. I do it in Jindal, I do it in Neemrana, where you can have practitioners
Yes.
come and teach electives, spread out your 20 lectures over a period of time, and test your students by a moot proposition on that particular proposition instead of conventional answers and questions. Let people apply their mind. Develop practitioners coming in, invite them.
Absolutely, and that's always been the approach that we've taken here at Sai University, and we'll continue to do that. We are launching our LLM program this year. We will also start an LLB in the coming years, and our guiding principle will always be to have a generous mix of practitioners and academics teaching all courses. And for sure, I hope that we can continue engaging with you and we can host you for more like this.
Definitely. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
All the best. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.